Hi, good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever in the world you are today. Thank you for joining me today in the session about risk intelligence, some of the lessons learned from attacks that we have observed and analyzed. And my name is Michael Godeker, CEO of Hakdefnet, and I'm also a security researcher that looks into different types of attacks that are classified as the three cybers. So that's espionage, warfare, and crime. And then we take a look at these different specific types of attacks, try to understand how they happened, take a look at the details of the attacks and the code itself, reverse engineer the components or review reverse engineered reports of our partners, and then we discuss and determine how we could use risk intelligence to stop these attacks from happening before the actual attack, find out where we can take a look at specific types of information to avoid these attacks, and how cyber insight and our solutions can add value to you, your bottom line, and protect your revenue by using a risk intelligence approach. So I'd like to start off by talking about what's the difference between how we are on the road and sell security and services and maybe how other folks do. And the reason for this is very simple. We're talking, today is Thursday, the 18th of May, and there's a lot of different discussions going on about WannaCry and how antivirus and other solutions are the perfect thing to buy because if you don't buy them, you're not secure. And we have a different approach to that, and we don't like talking about fear or instilling fear in customers and partners because that's just not the right way to tackle a complex security project process and the issues around ransomware and specific attacks in the UK in general. So here for us, it's not about fear, it's about awareness, or in this case, risk awareness. And one of the best ways to bring this home is to take a look at a simple picture that shows us the difference between a threat intelligence or a threat and risk. So this picture is, in my opinion, a perfect example of threat and threat intelligence. So while a specific situation is happening that is currently being exploited, in this case, a photographer is taking the picture of an animal, an elk or a buck, and while he's taking that picture, he doesn't have the situational awareness to understand that this thing is closing in on him very quickly and is going to basically collide with him in a few seconds. And this is one of the big differences between threat intelligence and risk intelligence. So with threat intelligence, we're observing things that are happening now or close to now. And in risk management or risk intelligence, we're trying to find out what can happen, what can result in an attack, what kind of exploits that attack or threat can take, and how can we avoid it if possible or mitigate that risk, right? So time context is important. Risk intelligence basically deals with before the attacks happen and trying to find them before they happen. And threat intelligence is trying to find an attack that's currently going on or just about to happen. And the types of data that you collect based on those are going to be different. So with risk intelligence, you have usually unstructured data. You need to know where to look. You need to have experience in research and analysis. And in threat intelligence, you have various different types of feeds that give you IPs, domains, DNS information, all that kind of stuff that is based off of people that have observed an attack or something that's currently going on. Very often, we start off our discussions with folks about if security makes sense, add value or not, and if they need something in addition to what they either already have or if they don't have something. And very often, the situational awareness or risk awareness of most companies that we talk to, they basically tell us the same thing. We don't need security. We don't need more security. We already have a firewall. We have an antivirus in place, and we're already protected. Nothing can happen to us. Or we don't see the value in protecting that because if we do, we have to invest X amount of dollars. We're not sure what value it gives us. So we're here to basically crash that idea because we believe that risk intelligence is affordable. We believe that risk intelligence helps you save money, a lot of money, because if you can find out where attacks can happen or where they can come from, then at least you have enough awareness to implement and tweak things that you either already have or to lock down and to do things because an attack is just about to happen, right? So when we take a look at this about we don't need more security, we take a look at what's going on in the dark web. We talk about data that's out there that's getting dumped that you can basically buy for about 10 bucks, 5 to 10 bucks. We take a look at hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes of data that are being shared by various different groups in the darknet and in various different forums. And then we see, for instance, a bigger picture where one example is 151 databases, over 2.2 billion types of users. This is, for us, just one type of risk, right? So the one type of risk in this instance is, okay, well, you have a breached account. The likelihood of that breached account being used to break into your system is higher when you appear in various different numbers of these breaches in the example that you see above. So the more breaches your name and your password is found in, the higher the likelihood is, or probability, and here we're talking about Bayesian probabilities here, which is open source mathematics. The more databases that you're involved in, your password, etc., the higher the likelihood is that that information will be used to break into or breach your security, right? And I think it's a logical and very clear statement. And this is just to show you there's a lot of data out there and a lot of people aren't even aware of this, right? So how is this risk relevant to you? How can you use that to protect yourself? When we take a look at the development of attacks between February 2016 and February this year, we find a very interesting difference in the types of attacks that were reported for that specific month last year and this year. So last year we saw healthcare, software, political parties, charities, and human rights organizations being attacked, with the highest ones being healthcare. And then in February this year we saw 40% of politicians or politics and political websites were being hacked. Then 20% of healthcare, 20% of music festivals, which was new, and then 20% of family counseling, which is also new. Now, some of these information, all four of these are actually relevant to private lives and also to public lives. So the emphasis is moving away from, for instance, software and other things, more towards data and information. So when we take a look at how these threats and risks are currently identified, we see that the assumptions about what motivations are behind those attacks is entirely different. So if we have information and data, is it really cybercrime or not? The answer is it depends. We believe that in this graph, the 64.5% of cybercrime, 22.4% of cyber espionage, 7.9% of hacktivism, and 5.3% in cyber warfare is wrong. We believe that around at least 60 to 75% of all attacks are cyber espionage and cyber warfare related at this point in time. And the reason for that is very simple and also complex. The way you identify an attack is based off of different parameters and reports of information from people that are giving you their information of their own free will. So depending on what their awareness is and how they collect the information, the numbers will reflect reality or it will reflect their reality, right? So knowing that if someone is trained in forensics principles and they're neutral, they will try to find a different way of categorizing and summarizing the different types of attacks. And this is something that you see here in this result, which results in erroneous numbers, we believe, for cybercrime. Now, if something is cybercrime, there needs to be some type of financial basis for the attack. If you can't pinpoint that, then you need to assume it's something else. And that's what we observe in a lot of the different attacks that we're involved in. So keeping awareness as a principle in mind, now we often find that there are different versions of those realities, and that, like I said, those realities will be dependent on the teams that collect the information and how they assess the results of what they're seeing in front of them. So when we take that reality and compare it to the reported attacks, for instance, from Hackmageddon previously, we see that there are interesting changes in how the attacks evolved, and also that the traditional targets are moving away towards non-traditional targets of data and information, sentiment, and emotions. We can see then in this slide how the different vectors have moved from time to time from the past to now, and that these different types of technologies that are in and of themselves separate attacks can be combined, and they ultimately lead to what we call new vectors or new generation or next generation types of attacks. Some of these are very clear. If you see the next generation influence through the other three columns, you'll see that we have crypto-locker malware and recycled code. Recycled code just basically means that if you're working with an antivirus that uses traditional signature or heuristics based and basically behavioral analysis, If you change code and add features to it, and that behavior is different than anything you've categorized in the past, the question is, will that antivirus pick it up or won't it? And more often than not, the antivirus won't pick it up because it doesn't match to a signature, it doesn't match to a specific heuristic, it doesn't match to a specific behavior pattern that the antivirus can capture. Now, if you move all the way down the next generation column down to critical infrastructure, cyber war, and espionage, and then the last part, data and social media manipulation, an antivirus won't necessarily be able to help you with these different types of things. Yet, next generation attacks can use a combination of social engineering, web applications, hardware hacking, as well as data and social media manipulation, depending on what their actual target is. So next gen attacks are not typically detected by antiviruses, and it's going to continue in that direction, we believe. If you take a look at the different processes and procedures behind these, you'll see that social engineering was people's and process, or focused on people and processes. Web applications focused on processes and software. Hardware hacking focused on software and devices. And then next generation manipulates all those different things, but it also uses information and emotions as a new vector to basically achieve its ultimate goal or agenda. So if we talk about that influence, we talk about how these vectors change, we ultimately wind up talking about something that is new to some people called hybrid warfare. So what is hybrid warfare? Hybrid warfare is basically a combination of different types of things that you can use that are conventional, things that are unconventional, that are basically tools in your warfare chest to do or achieve a specific goal. Primarily, this type of stuff is focused more on nation states and using a more militaristic approach to attacks, but this can apply to cybercrime groups as well if they are military focused or if they work like that. So it applies to both. So hybrid warfare uses irregular forces on, if we take a look at the right-hand side, we have irregular forces, we have support of local unrest, we have information, warfare, and propaganda, and diplomacy. I think we can see a lot of similarities in some of those recent attacks and what's all going on social media and other things based on this very simple diagram. But what that means is these things ultimately lead to these different types of attacks. They leverage, for instance, data and information, open source intel. They leverage information, disinformation, propaganda, social media, phishing attacks, comms interception, using a combination of botnets to look like cybercrime when in reality they're nothing but cybercrime, right? Or they actually aren't cybercrime, they're espionage or warfare or very detailed, dedicated campaigns. And then lastly, social engineering, which has different points that are in the specific subcategories as well. If we take a look at that, then take a look at hybrid warfare and how that's relevant, we ultimately get to what's called the cyber kill chain. Now in the cyber kill chain, there's different processes that we use to basically breach or achieve an objective. First one is reconnaissance, where we're using and harvesting any type of information where OSINT falls in, right? So email addresses, conference information, any type of personal information, for instance, the attack vectors like political party memberships, if your family has been to counseling, that kind of stuff, or weaponization, where you then use the information in the previous one, phase, reconnaissance, of people, systems, applications, etc. Find out if there are any exploits out there or backdoors that you can leverage into a new payload. You wrap that payload into a delivery mechanism in phase 3, and you weaponize that bundle to send it to a victim via email, web, USB, etc., depending on what you scoped out and found out about that person. Then you exploit that specific area by using a vulnerability that can then execute that specific infector or code on the victim's systems or system. You install that malware on the asset, you communicate with a command and control server that either waits for day 0 if it's a campaign or installs additional features on the clients based on what you need. And then lastly, you have the action on objectives, which is that hands-on keyboard type of access where intruders try to accomplish access to specific systems, do reverse forensics, lead you in different areas or in the false directions while they're trying to manipulate and get the data that they're initially after or disrupt those systems, right? When we get to that, then the next piece is then, so why do groups or attackers use the internet or computer-based attacks or so-called quote-unquote cyber threats to leverage their campaigns and to also sell that as a service? And the reasons are very, very clear. If you're a nation state, the investments that you make into cyber weapons ultimately lead to what we discussed before as next generation cyber threats. Now, the objective is clear. If you create a next generation cyber threat, that cyber threat can no longer be remediated through classical antivirus, and it can't be detected because the vectors are different and they're not in a signature, a heuristic sample, or in a specific modus operandi of what something did in the past, right? Here is one of the emphasis then on risk intelligence, and where risk intelligence really comes into play, working against a lot of these different things and making the costs higher. So the second piece is the cost of massive widespread attacks are low. And the chances of being discovered are very, very minimal, if not to say almost impossible. And there are different reasons for that, but one of the reasons we're seeing more and more is the use of what we call quote-unquote proxy architectures, or companies or teams that are used to actually hide the attackers or the original attackers behind this specific campaign. Now, things like plausible deniability, if you don't exactly know or can't pinpoint the specific nation state behind an attack, you can't say beyond the shadow of a doubt that it was, for instance, a specific country or a specific institution, which is a pro and a con. For researchers, it's a con because it's extremely aggravating to see signs that are similar throughout different types of attacks that have been known for nation states. But as a forensics analyst, you can't say beyond the shadow of a doubt, okay, well, we have the evidence that supports it's this country or that country, right? And that will continue. Then we have a mixture of the three cybers, so warfare, espionage, and crime. And here we see that the lines are blurry, and what it ultimately leads to, again, are next-gen cyber threats, because the technology is shared throughout these three different areas with each other, and they're reverse engineered, and they result in new cybercrime types of waves, etc., that are harder and harder to stop, to discover, and to basically understand, right? So here we have that code reuse or recycling, which basically makes things a lot more difficult, which is the reason why if we talk about an antivirus signature for instance, WannaCry, it's okay, better than having nothing. But if we take a look at what is the risk that there are other ransomware samples out there, those risks are very high. So one specific signature is probably not going to help you as much as knowing where the next risks are coming from. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. So lastly, we have all this different technology that can be used to cause physical or actual real damage via attacking critical infrastructure and IoT systems that are used in specific targeted campaigns to disrupt, to destroy infrastructure, to make things easier for a specific threat actor to basically use to their advantage, right? So disruptions, disinformation, propaganda, that kind of stuff is fantastic, because if you basically spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt, people cannot focus their resources on the right things and stay objective and neutral to what's really going on. So before we get into the details of the attacks, it's interesting and important to talk about what the darknet is, because different people have different opinions of that. And our focus and our understanding of the darknet is the following. The darknet is basically an entire own network that requires a specific way to enter that network, which then results in the information and traffic being encrypted through onion routing, and which guarantees or supplies a certain amount of anonymization. When you're in the network, then you also have access to what's called a deep web index, which includes its own DNS, network infrastructure, and searching services, which then ultimately lead to what we call the dark web or the deep web. The dark web and deep web is a hidden net, and it's also an invisible net. So if you don't know where to look, you don't know what websites are out there, and you can't search for them, you cannot find them, and you cannot do any research on them. So this requires a lot of analysis, this requires a lot of experience, and to know where to look, and then to take the information from there. And this is where we really help with risk intelligence, and where antivirus, firewalls, and that type of technology are absolutely hopeless, because they don't target this stuff, and they can't, because it's not their objective. It's another difference between risk intelligence and threat intelligence, right? So here we then take a look at things which are more important, like darknet markets and hidden services, and this is where the rubber really hits the road. So in darknet markets, you'll find a lot of different information and things that are being sold and data that's being traded. In hidden services, you'll find a lot of different services that you can buy for anything, and this includes this ransomware stuff that everyone's talking about now, and that they're saying If you have R1 signature, you're protected against everything, and that's not really the case. So taking a look at the fire sale attack, and I won't get into too much details because there's enough stuff that we've published on our channel about these in more detail. So we had 6 different phases here. We had the planning phase where a plan was created. They collected information on targets, developed infection vectors, and then used phishing and social engineering and build a CNC architecture. In the infection phase, the initial infection started looking at the blind spots from phase 1. Then phase 3 discovered different systems, installed components that basically started infections and basically looked for administrative accounts to go to infection phase 2, which is number 4. Then after 4 and everything was installed, a timer was installed. They waited for new orders and instructions from the CNC server, which then resulted in day 0, which was the day of the elections, just before the elections were about to happen. A massive industry-wide disruption was done on election day to make sure that people couldn't get their information, and then an enormous amount of fear, uncertainty, doubt, as well as disruptions were caused to try to change the results of that election. And we've seen enough of these examples before to think that maybe if we take a look at these different types of attacks, the attackers could either be the same, similar, or have very similar influences, right? And then lastly, disinformation. Once we found the details about IPs and servers, they suddenly went offline, and on the website of a Facebook group that we followed that we think is responsible, called Cyberberg Group, which does have ties to Russia, they suddenly posted a message that their websites were hacked. Interesting. And the servers went offline. We also mapped these attacks to different signatures that we have followed back to APT38, to Sandworm, and other published and well-known attacks. By the way, kudos to the people that published those reports. Thank you very much. We did find this one, but it's always good to use research from other folks to help you get up to speed fairly quickly or faster. So looking at the fire sale attacks, some of the typical points that were leveraged were VPN rules and compromised clients that then were not detected by firewalls. Then we see unnecessary ports and services that were running on different systems that could be leveraged and used. The lack of network access controls because it's either too difficult or it didn't detect things. Looking at applications or media servers and that kind of stuff that had backdoors or had weak passwords. And then ultimately getting access to supervisory networks and other results like domain controllers, DNS, and all that kind of stuff, where you can do really fancy schmancy stuff like DNS poisoning, install new GPOs, install signed drivers, and get the entire infrastructure infected and connected with CNC. Right? After that attack, the media industry was one we saw 5 other attacks happen. Power grid happened about a month later. After that, the airport happened a few weeks after that. Then the power grid was attacked again. After that, we went away from Ukraine, went to European and US-based attacks for the metal industry in Thyssen, the Bundestag, and critical infrastructure in other countries. And then we saw some other similarities to the US DNC and election type of disruptions that we saw that are now being released to the public that also had some similarities. There were some differences, but there were quite a few similarities as well. So while going through that, the US elections, we predicted that Black Energy 3 was just a POC, that more attacks would happen. We saw in Ukraine that attacks did happen after that. And then we saw that basically disrupting election day or elections is a viable solution as a warfare tactic, as an espionage tactic, as well as a disruption tactic. So around 8:30 in the morning during election day, we saw that craziness started. Different types of attacks from around 14,000 clients happened. They attacked certain areas in the US that resulted in communications networks basically being entirely disrupted or DDoSed through what was called the Mirai botnet, which no one or not many people knew at that point in time. I'll get to that in a minute. Interesting is that a lot of the targets that were here were potentially swing states that weren't sure how they would decide for which candidate. And then we saw 1 or 2 other states just to mix things up enough to make it not look like it was a coordinated attack. Was it? It's anyone's guess. If you interpret the information, it does at the very least look very interesting and could indicate a direction. While that attack was going on in election days, it was different than the previous DDoS attacks that we saw that were based off of Lizard Squad. So we saw that there were different goals going on. We saw disruptions that were similar to the ones in Ukraine's, and we asked ourselves if that was the same actor. If you take a look on the right, we have an example of the code that was released on Pastebin during those or just before the elections happened. And here we saw the infector that was connecting to a busy box looking for hard-coded passwords, using the hard-coded passwords to then inject a payload, which would then be used as a bot member. These DDoS attacks happened during that day. The Mirai infectors, around 14,000 in this case. We then saw massive infections going on while targets were being attacked. We saw a lot of telnet traffic, a lot of irregular HTTP traffic meant to disrupt websites, etc. We also saw that port 7547, or those DSL management ports and modems, were used. And most of the targets that got hit were telcos, so strategically communications that were used, we believe, for communicating the voters' results back to headquarters and to national headquarters, right? So there were a lot of different botnets out there, and the potentiality for port 7547 is listed here in a Shodan report that we did way back when. We now have our own data so that we can have more realistic data that's up to date and we can ping and test and do a whole bunch of different other things on, but we're talking about millions of hosts, which is a huge potential. You only need about 1-2 million hosts at the most. You probably only not even need 1 million. With 200 to 300,000 clients, you can basically disrupt an entire country or smaller country. With a few million, you can definitely shut down a bigger country like the United States or other countries around the world like Russia or etc. So after that, we also observed that during the elections campaign were going on, a new vector was being used, and here we saw propaganda that was very GRU FSB-like. We asked ourselves if it was against the government, but then after we observed more traffic, we saw that there were specific signs that people were trying to manipulate election results. And we saw coordination with WikiLeaks and people that painted themselves as pro-Trump supporters, but when we did a detailed analysis on the users, we found a lot of these folks were in Eastern Europe and weren't even American citizens. So you be the judge of what's behind that. Hundreds and thousands of users were spawned to basically post, or excuse my French, shit post on anyone that had anything against the elections or a specific group or WikiLeaks, and they basically attacked all these different people to keep them busy, to avoid them making specific comments about what was going on in the elections and spreading information about detailed attacks that were going on. Was it nation state or not? You should be the judge of that and analyze the data and find out if you can find evidence that points in one direction or another, or that may show a tendency. While that was going on, or after that was going on, we had additional information leaks from shadow brokers. Those were the guys that released some of that really nifty hardware code that resulted in a lot of the threats and stuff that we have right now. So they were leveraging the Tor network as well. You see on the I2P usage here. They were also spreading information, pictures, snapshots, and URLs about sample code that was released in the August timeframe, and they did a few other releases throughout the last few months that have also added fire and fuel to the attacks that we've seen in the last few days. WikiLeaks also released information about Vault 7 series, which included certain types of exploits that are being reused in current attacks and in previous attacks by various different groups and or nation states, question mark, question mark, question mark. You be the judge of that. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the ultimate agenda of these guys releasing the information? In the regards to shadow brokers, we saw that they had very broken English, which would indicate that maybe another nation state is behind that, trying to act as a crime group. They may have gotten the information from information that either a leaker like Snowden or someone else released, or they may have gotten the information through intrusion attempts of their own groups that they are then using to build up or to get money and or to spread and disrupt communications and public sentiment and emotion. Bots still continue today. We can see that on some of the more details of the SMB related or WannaCry related traffic. We see Brazil, we see China, we see Mexico, Philippines, and then we're starting to see some more IPs from the US and Holland also coming up. These are targeting our honeypots that we have set up, and we are getting some really interesting results. We've monitored these things since just before the attacks went public, and we're seeing a trend that is increasing more and more. And since WannaCry, these attacks have increased 10 to 20 fold. Moving on to WannaCry and ransomware, some of the things that we want to point out is that having a signature for one specific ransomware or threat is not going to cut the mustard, and it doesn't really resolve the actual issues that we face. We believe, and I believe, that risk intelligence is the only real way to help you in a coordinated way, shape, and form to combat these different types of risks and potential threats. So this by no means means that if you just buy one product from us or someone else that it will resolve that issue. It's a lot more complex than that, but finding out where the risks are that help you think ahead of an attack will highlight, as a security perspective, the reason to invest in security infrastructure, because the problem is very, very real. It's not something that will be resolved by one antivirus solution, regardless of who they call themselves. It will not be resolved by one signature, regardless of what these antivirus companies say. The risks and threats are more real and more prolific than a lot of people think. An example of this is we use our solution to map what different types of risks and threats are out there in the dark net as well as in the normal net. And we pick up information about how cheap it is to actually buy malware, rats or remote administration tools, different types of ransomware samples. Like for instance, here we see source code for blackmail Bitcoin. And Bitcoin has been used for quite a while. For 10 bucks, you can buy that. There's also customizable ransomware in C for $3. So there's a lot of different things out here, and a lot of these don't really have signatures yet because they're continuously evolving. And if you don't know and are not aware of these things, it's not going to help you with one specific signature. And then you have different services that are so complex that they cost a little bit more money, but you have support. You have a dedicated team of people that'll help you. For instance, in this example with Gosnim botnet installation and support. Right? So let's get to how we help. We have an infrastructure that we built over a certain amount of time. We've taken over 20 plus years of different types of implementation of projects, security products, antivirus, everything else, and we learned a few lessons. What we came up with is an infrastructure and architecture that's simple, expandable, open, and ready to use. We have sensors and data that we pull in from various different sources. We have our cloud infrastructure that leverages automation and artificial intelligence that is meant for self-defense. We have a GUI basically to make everything very, very nice and simple and unified throughout the sensors and also the system. We have our own technology that looks at different types of things and classifies them as risks, scores the results that come back in various different ways that are flexible and customizable. And then we also offer the option, if you don't want to use cloud-based solutions, then also to use appliances that we can build for you or VMs that we can build for you to leverage this. Some of the things that we do, and I used one of the antivirus company's slide decks and modified it to what we're doing. So here we have on one area the smart devices and home automation, which is a risk potential. We have the IoT or Internet of Things, which is another risk potential. And then on the bottom we have the risk intelligence, classical intelligence that we do, which includes anything and everything that's connected in any way, shape, or form on the internet, on Tor networks, or things that are unstructured and structured. Either things that are connected or things that you or our partners see. We can dump into the solution, analyze it, score it, find out where the next risks in the text will be coming from, and then give you that intelligence fairly quickly. And we think that's a very powerful message in a simple picture. So what does that look like in details? Here's an overview of our sensors and what they look like. We have modified open source versions of firewalls that are locked down, that have hardened kernels. So in this instance, we have a modified version of OpenSense that we've customized, and we've also added components that make sense and connect to our APIs and our intelligence network. We can also send out information about new attacks that we're finding here and put them into new rules if required. Then taking a look at our dashboard, we make it very, very easy and simple to find out things. So it starts off with searching everything from one overview. Then you can take a look at the specific area that you want to take a look at and what your subscription is. You can start with an IP, domain, email, or whatever. You'll get to the information very quickly. Did we find threats? Did we not find threats or risks? what do the components that we add on top of that look like? Did we find any specific threats that you can analyze before they turn into actual threats? So we're talking about risk intelligence. We can also do things like Nmap results that'll tell you, okay, well, this could be a potential threat because too many ports are open. If the ports are open, then now would be a good time to lock them down and to use a more proactive security approach, right? So when we do find things, it looks like this. So we have the search again. We found specific risks. Here we found that a compromised account led back to this IP. We found it about 1 or 2 months ago. Now would be a good time to change your passwords or to take a look at the systems if something was compromised based on this breached information. One of many threats and risks that we look at. Another option is we can import just about any type of information from any system out there in the world today in text format, in CSV format, etc. We can also automatically parse that information, which then results in overall risks that we manage throughout the world. And we also take a look at any types of accounts that are breached, that have been compromised where passwords are known. And here's an example in account breaches. You can add new breaches as they become available, and then you can add that information and map that to your infrastructure at any time. It's a powerful thing, isn't it? We currently are tracking over 4 billion risks and accounts globally, and that number is increasing every day because more and more risk information becomes available. We categorize it, score it, and then put it into our website. So the question then becomes, what if you don't have something or an account was not breached? How do you look for potential risks that could wind up into future threats? And it's very simple. You need to do your research. And here we automated research as much as possible to speed up the process by up to 90%, where we basically can put in specific queries, keywords, samples of data, code, etc., to then speed up the process and take a look at that information. So here we have that information. We have the returned results. You can scan these using the normal network, or if they're in the Tor network, you can use them scanning the Tor network, right? Another option that we use is then social media risk analysis, where you can take a look at specific potential risks from people that are following you. So if you have a Twitter handle, you want to take a look at who's following you, who your friends are, who their friends and their followers are. This is a fantastic example of using that for social media analysis. And then you can then download the CSV files to use in either your own analysis platform, or you can integrate it into whatever solution that you have, right? Digging a little bit deeper into OSINT and risk analysis, here we have the possibility of looking at different types of data. In this case, we're looking at websites, forums, that kind of stuff. And we're looking at all the different URLs with or without authentication. And we can find out if we had specific matches to a specific risk or threat that we're looking for in this specific campaign, in this specific group, malware, etc. I think the solution is extremely powerful when you think about what options you have with this type of analysis. Here we're looking at things that are unstructured. We're looking at things that aren't threats, that aren't known by any threat feed throughout the world. We're looking for things that have not resulted in attacks yet. And this is very powerful because when you can do this, you can prepare for things that you think will happen in the future, which saves you a lot of money, a lot of pain, aggravation, and can protect your data a lot more efficiently than if you just depend on a firewall or on an antivirus, which is not going to be able to protect you from threats that you don't know are going to happen, right? So then what we also do is, to speed things up even more, we can do different types of analysis based on neural networks and also Bayesian probabilities to take a look at, if we're looking at specific information, if this is relevant for a specific risk or threat, and then scoring the results back on that risk and that threat. Some of the ideas that we have are looking at things from risk assessments, reportings, that kind of stuff. We can also take a look at various different types of things like pastebin, other types of information that are coming out, Twitter, other types of social media, and then also calculate the risk probabilities, what the status is, and where we're pulling in the data from, right? So with that,